a couple of years ago, I led this young man to the Lord. And he was a new Christian. He was very excited. But when he went to his job, or I think he may have been in school, and he was sharing with his co-workers or friends that who was a born-again child of God and that he was saved, some of his co-workers began to challenge him and say, oh, well, you believe in the Bible. Well, you know the Bible condones slavery and says slavery is okay. And then that kind of confused him, so he came back to me and he says, well, does the Bible say that slavery is okay? And so sometimes you get these naysayers that will try to take things out of context or take things out of the Bible and try to make a negative out of it. Now, let me say this, and this is not a Sunday school lesson about slavery, but I just want to hit some high points just for you to be able to research and do your own, or maybe we need to have a separate Sunday school lesson about this. The Bible does indeed address slavery. The Bible does talk about slavery. As a matter of fact, in the Mosaic Law, there are actually laws that talk about how to buy and sell bond servants and things of that nature. But we have to keep this in mind. Number one, the word slave or slavery only appears in the King James Bible about 2 or 3 times. You will see the word bond, bondsman, bondservant, bondmaiden, or you'll see that terminology, which means the same thing. To be in bondage is the same thing as being in slavery. However, it can also have a different connotation as well, because the word bond can also be a reference to something financial. You've heard of stocks and when you go to the school has to raise money to add on to the building, they would have a school bond election, right? And they use the word bond. So sometimes bond can have a fiduciary or a financial connotation to it. So it kind of depends on how it's used, but in most cases you will see the word bondsman or bondservant used instead of slave. Okay, but still, bondsman and slave mean the same thing. For the most part, in Scripture, when God told Moses to write the Mosaic Law dealing with slavery, it was for 2 primary reasons. Prisoners of war, okay, because when God sent the children of Israel to go to battle against another country, God basically gave them 2 instructions. He told them to either go to that other country, kill every man, woman, child, suckling means infant, cattle, right? You say, wow, kill the cattle too? Yeah.
Kill everything.
Kill everything. This was especially true with the Amalekites, all right? God said, wipe out everything. Don't leave anything alive. I don't even want to hear a sheep bleeding. I want everything dead. God would say either kill everything, or sometimes God would give the instruction, I want you to kill everything but the women and children. And I think Numbers 21 is an example of that. I'm going to have to go back and check that. But there was at least one case, that I'm sure there's more than one case, where God said kill everything except the women, the virgin women of the village, and the prisoners of war, POW, the prisoners of war became the bond servants of the children of Israel. All right? Okay, so prisoners of war was one example of bondage, and then God had certain rules for those prisoners of war. The other example of bondage is just like what Jesus is talking about here in verse 25. If a person owed someone else money and they were not able to pay it, they would sell themselves into bondage for a certain period of time until that debt was paid. All right? And so God had certain allowances to say, this is how you treat this bond servant, right? Because now this person has to work for you until this debt is paid. Okay, how many of you have ever seen a TV show where a guy is sitting in the restaurant, he's eating a steak, and at the end of the meal he reaches for his wallet, he doesn't have his wallet, and then the restaurant manager comes out and says what? Throws an apron at him and says, you got to go in the back and do what?
Dishes.
Okay, so what is the guy doing? He has to pay off, he has to work off his debt because he has no way to pay the man. So the customer of the restaurant is selling himself into bondage for the restaurant manager, and he has to work that debt off for that steak. that he ate. Y'all see how that works? And so what this is saying right here, so when God has these rules for slavery, it's not that he's condoning slavery, it's that God knows that there are going to be people who are going to steal things or who are going to put themselves in situations where they're going to be in debt and not be able to pay it off. And God says, this is how you handle that situation.
Servitude.
Okay? By servitude. Y'all see that? And there's an example of that if you were to turn, and like I said, I didn't want to spend too much time on this, but if you turn back to the book of Exodus, we were in Exodus 20 earlier. I know we were doing that by memory. But if you turn to Exodus, the 22nd chapter, if you turn to Exodus, the 22nd chapter, I just want to just give this one Old Testament point real quick, and then we'll get back on the lesson of forgiveness. It says in Exodus, the 22nd chapter, starting at the first verse, it says, if a man shall steal an ox or a sheep or kill it or sell it, he shall restore 5 oxen for an ox or 4 sheep for a sheep. Okay, that's what God says you should do. If you steal something, you restore it 5-fold or 6-fold. That's what God says you should do. Now it says, verse 2, if a thief be found breaking up and be smitten that he die, there should be no blood shed for him. This is what Texas castle law is based upon, by the way. Texas castle law is based upon Exodus 22:2, where if somebody comes to you in the middle of the night and you don't know what's going on and you kill that person in the middle of the night, then no charges will be filed against you. That's based upon Exodus 22, but that's another Sunday school lesson. I'm not going to get into that now. Okay? Verse 3, it says, if the sun be risen on him, there shall be blood shed for him, for he shall make full restitution. Look at this. If he has nothing, what happens?
Then he shall be sold.
So that is the definition of how God, quote unquote, supports slavery. Okay, if a person is not able to pay off a debt, then they become the bondservant. Okay, so prisoner of war, or if the person's unable to pay off a debt, those are the types of slavery that the Lord has rules for, that he makes allowances for. That does not necessarily mean he condones it, but that means that he just has rules in place to allow for it. Okay, keep in mind too that God also had rules in place for the children of Israel if they were to have a king. All right, he says if you have a king, your king should not multiply wives, they should not do this, and they shall keep the laws of God. But it was never God's desire for the children of Israel to have a king. But God made a rule for the children of Israel having a king hundreds of years before they actually had a king, because they were ruled by judges. That's the reason you have the books of the Bible, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, right? Then you have 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, Judges comes before, and then during the time of 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, Samuel was the last quote-unquote judge before the era of the kings, where you had Saul was the first king and King David was the second king, all right? And so God had always wanted the children of Israel to be ruled by judges. But then, even though that was his desire, hundreds of years ago, he made a rule for kings, even though he never wanted the people to have kings. Because God sits out of, he knew it was going to happen. He sits outside of time. He made allowances for it. And so, just because God makes allowances for certain things, he makes allowances for divorce. But if you look in the 2nd chapter of Malachi, God never intended for anyone to get a divorce.
Nope.
But he made allowances for it. Okay? So just because God makes allowances for something, it doesn't necessarily mean that he condones it or approves of it. Okay? Is that okay? All right. So I'm going to stop. Yeah.
The Bible condones slavery. It's just dishonest. It's not true.
Yes, but a lot of people will just say anything to discount the Bible. And like I said, this was a new Christian. He was excited, and they slap him with this. And, oh, well, you believe the Bible. You believe that slavery is okay. Not understanding the history or the context or the origins behind the way things were done, during the time. And in a lot of ways, the way things are done now, people are really slaves now to the credit card. Because when you get your paycheck, what happens? the first thing you do, you get your paycheck, and you pay your bills. So you're a slave to MasterCard. It's just in a different way, or Visa or American Express or whatever. It's just they didn't have credit cards back then, so they just sold themselves into slavery in order to pay off their debt.
That was a Visa.
So, yeah.
I mean, do you think they might not intentionally be saying that? It might just be out of ignorance that they don't understand. Because if I read it and I'm hearing bondage and slavery, I thought so. I didn't know that that's what it meant until just now. That it was. I knew they did it to pay debts, but I thought also that they did have slaves at the time, and so.
Oh, absolutely. Abraham had a slave. He had a child by Hagar, who was a Ethiopian. Was she Ethiopian?
No, sure.
Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, wasn't she? Or was she Egyptian? Well, it doesn't matter. She was a bondmaid. Yeah.
Just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean that God condoned it.
Yeah.
That's history.
Right.
And that's what I'm saying. But some people, when he went and was explaining this to his friends or his coworkers, whatever it was.
Yeah.
The coworkers might not have been doing. I don't know what they were saying, how they were saying it.
Uh-huh.
Were they saying it to be malicious, or were they saying it?
That's
what they were understanding.
My understanding of it, that they were saying it to be malicious. And then you also have to keep in mind that the scriptures say in the New Testament that the natural man does not understand spiritual things. And so...
And they hadn't read it. You got to read it in order to know.
I know, but I read the Bible and I didn't understand it. I mean, I understood parts of it, but I wasn't saying God was condoning slavery, but it was...
Yeah.
Part of the
She was
history.
Egyptian.
Yeah.
Genesis 16 and 1.
Okay, thank you.
Time.
Yeah. And so you have to keep in mind too, there were horrible examples of slavery. The children of Israel were slaves. And God was very sensitive to the issue of slavery. If anyone didn't want slavery, it would have been God, because God's people had just been delivered from slavery. The reason he had Moses bring them out of the land of Egypt. So God was very sensitive to slavery.
He's not saying to have a slave just because you want to have a slave. He's saying to have a slave because they have to pay their debt.
Yes.
That's why he's okay. In that case, that's why he's okay with slavery. It's serving a purpose.
Yeah, it's fulfilling the purpose. And even in the case of a thief, they say, hey, because a lot of people don't know, God never invented the jail. God never invented the prison. That's man's invention. God says if you have a thief, make that thief work off his debt. Now they have this thing nowadays, and I've said it, I've been guilty of it too. When a person is released from prison, they say he's paid his debt to society, which meant that he made some license plates or whatever he worked for society. That's paying his debt to society. That's the slang that we use that's kind of lost its meaning over the years.
That's when they had to change it.
They still got that, believe it or not.
Oh, they did?
I was
Yeah.
supposed to work down in Huntsville. And
Oh yeah, Huntsville's kind of tough.
down there, and I'm telling you,
Yeah,
man,
Huntsville's
they come
kinda
through,
tough.
They come through, they be on a bus all chained up, and they stop, get them off the bus, and they got them out there working.
Yeah.
And they got an overseer guy out there, and
Yeah.
they are still working in Texas.
Yeah.
I think then they use the word slave different from what we would say now. Now we're saying paying a debt.
Yes.
Then they use a slave because this person's just, I'm working for you, cleaning your house, I'm washing your clothes, or whatever it is, to pay my debt because I don't have the funds to pay you back.
Right, but keep in mind too, like I said, the King James Bible only uses the word slave 2 or 3 times. It really uses the word bondservant or bondsman. And I believe it does that for a meaning. Yes, does it mean the same thing? Yes, but you can also understand there's a tiny difference between the two from a financial standpoint.
It's totally different, just because that was way before in the beginning. Now, when slavery came in, they changed
The whole definition.
So just because we call it slavery now, it doesn't mean we were right.
Right.
Yeah, and
It's just definition.
yeah, the slavery that was done.
Definition of it.
Yeah, the slavery that was done during the time of the children of Israel. Think about the Old Testament Joseph. He was kidnapped by his brothers and sold into slavery. Well, first of all, kidnapping is a capital offense according to the Mosaic law, right? Because if you're a man stealer, that's punishable by death. And then he was sold. You see, he didn't owe a debt to the people that came along that later would take him to Egypt, and he would go on to be the governor of Egypt. That was not a situation that Jesus is talking about here, or that God was talking about in the Old Testament. All right, so really didn't mean to get off on that topic.
What kind of slavery is back then? The children of Israel owned stuff, because when they were leaving Israel, they had items with them.
Well, yeah, part of the
household, and slaves
Yeah.
in the 1800s didn't have a household.
Well, and this is going to get off the subject again here too, but one of the rules that God made for those who were slaves after they had served their time, one of the rules that God said for the master of the bondservant was he was to give them material goods before he sent them on their way. So they weren't supposed to leave empty-handed after they have served their time. So in a lot of ways, they were almost, not quite, but they were almost a hired servant, because the Lord instructed them. It says, once the bondservant has served his time, give him such and such a thing before you send him on his way. And then there were other cases where God made alliances for those who wanted to stay. There are some bondservants who enjoyed being with a part of the master's house, that they would rather stay with the master and his family versus leaving. And God even has rules for what to do with a bondservant who doesn't want to leave the family. God has rules for that as well.
Got it all
So, but once again, it's not a situation where God is necessarily condoning it. He is just making rules to say, if this happened, do this. Yes.
It's fine.
Huh?
It's fine, it's okay.
It's okay? All right. Okay. And then too, think about this, and this kind of is going back to something that Rosalind mentioned a moment ago. Jacob had multiple wives. He had 2 wives, he had 2 concubines, and all of that type of stuff. Just because people did it back then doesn't mean that it's okay to do it now. And so sometimes when we see things like that, where King David, Solomon had 1,000 wives and concubines. So just because you read about something in the Bible, you have to read it in context and not say, okay, just because Solomon had 1,000 wives, it's okay for me to have 5 and 6 girlfriends and wives or whatever.
And it doesn't mean God condoned it.
And it doesn't mean that God condoned it. Actually, God was very much against it, but he allowed it because Solomon was David's son, and David was a man after God's own heart.
That's the whole thing, because a lot of people say, oh, well, you believe in a God who let that happen. No, God didn't let it happen. You still have free choice.
Free will, yeah.
Free will, I mean.
Yeah. Mhm.
So just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean God let it happen. It was free will of the people to do something against God's